Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to this talk organized by the Communist Party of Spain. Today, we are very happy to have Professor Radhika Desai with us to talk about NATO in the 21st century. Dr. Desai is a professor at the Department of Political Studies and director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba. In Winnipeg, Canada, she's the author of different books such as Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, and Geopolitical Economy After the US Hegemony, Globalization and Empire. She has been the editor and co-editor of Russia, Ukraine, and Contemporary Imperialism, Theoretical Engagements in Geopolitical Economy, Analytical Gains from Geopolitical Economy, and Revitalizing Marxist Theory for Today's Capitalism. She's also the author of numerous articles published in the New Left Review and the Third World Quarterly and other journals on political economy, Marxism, culture, and nationalism. So today, Professor Desai will talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A session for 20 minutes. So Mark will be responsible for reading and taking your questions on the chat. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, Radhika, and you might begin your talk.
Okay, thank you so much. I guess you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So thank you very much. Thanks to everyone who's here, and thanks to the Communist Party of Spain for this invitation. The title of my talk is very simply NATO in the 21st century, although perhaps we should call it NATO and imperialism in the 21st century. As everyone knows, there's at the moment the Munich Security Conference is going on, and there a very interesting opposition can be observed. On the one hand, NATO countries are ratcheting up tensions. The US is accusing Russia of committing war crimes and meddling in Moldova, and all the countries are, sort of pledging their support to arm Ukraine to the teeth. Meanwhile, Russia has not been invited, but China and the Chinese foreign minister is going around on the sidelines of the meeting, and he will be making a speech at the meeting, which will promote a completely contrasting approach to world affairs. So to understand what is at stake in this context, we need to understand imperialism properly, not least because so much of the left is really quite confused about it. And by left, I mean the very broad collection of parties and movements and so on that are on the left of the political spectrum. So, and the overall message that I want to give is that the time is now way past due to demand the abolition of NATO. Not just an end to its expansion, not just an end to this or that war that it has started, but an end to NATO itself. This is not just a moral imperative. It's not a question of preventing war. It's about rejecting what I call the overarmed incompetence and incoherence that is the putrescence of capitalism. That is to say, capitalism is decaying, and the result is this kind of NATO and NATO activity. NATO does not increase, but radically decreases the very European security it claims to want to secure. The reason is that its purpose is not to secure anything except a US-dominated world order, which is an imperialist world order. That is why it sports what anyone can see is a really perverted conception of security, which is to be achieved through arms rather than through promoting good relations among all the nations of the world. Moreover, ordinary Europeans need to be more aware of the destructive role that the United States has played in Europe historically, not just right now, but going back a long way, going back a century and more. NATO is just the latest instrumentality of this sort of destructive role. This has been true for a very long time, and the current proxy war against Russia being waged by the US and NATO makes it truer than ever. As most of you will know, the purpose of NATO was clearly articulated by Lord Ismay, who was NATO's first Secretary General. As he put it, the purpose of NATO was to keep the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out, by which was meant that the NATO was the chief instrumentality through which the United States claimed to play a major role in Europe. And in this, they wished to keep Germany as the most powerful potential competitor to US power down, and of course the Russians out. That is to say, to prevent Europeans from ever making good relations with the Russians. And I don't mean just the Soviets. As will become clear, it's the Russians. NATO has worked actively also against all the socialist impulses in Europe, which, of course, as most of you will know, were very strong in the post-Second World War period. And it has worked against development abroad, and of course against communism, which is a greater misfortune for Europe's working people than most can imagine. That is to say, the purpose of US strategy, of which NATO is an instrument, has been in fact to establish an imperial order in the world. So let's for a moment, in order to sort of understand what's at stake, let's for a moment just take a look at some of the main characteristics of the current war that NATO is pursuing against Russia over Ukraine. So the first and most important thing is that the war has been caused by NATO expansion. That Ukraine's NATO membership is on the table. Everybody keeps talking about it, although, of course, it is far from being achieved. Just today, Jens Stoltenberg has said basically that there is, essentially Ukraine would have to win this impossible war against Russia in order to gain membership of NATO. Thirdly, Ukraine may not be in NATO, but NATO is in Ukraine. And not only that, in this present context, Ukraine not being in NATO is actually very functional to US purposes and to functional to US purposes and NATO's purposes, because the point is this is both convenient and it is very profitable. If Ukraine had been in NATO, then of course any attack on NATO would have had to be responded to by all the countries concerned on their own dime. But since Ukraine is not in NATO, you can give arms, which is actually sell arms to Ukraine, run up a long bill, which whatever entity that survives as Ukraine will be liable for. And of course, this is a source of enormous profit and very little pain to the various countries that are involved in the war against Russia. Of course, NATO is using Ukraine as a proxy, and in doing so, it is destroying the country and its people. As John Mearsheimer likes to say, NATO is committed to fighting Russia till the last Ukrainian. And meanwhile, as some of you may know, even as the war is going on, encouraged by various Western agencies, including a whole slew of consultants and big business people and banks and so on, Ukraine is continuing the neoliberal project of privatization, anti-labor legislation, and so on. And of course, one should not forget that there are NATO is also actively supporting the pursuit of the war by using fascist units in Ukraine's army, and of course ensuring their influence in Ukrainian politics and so on. Further, NATO is providing, of course, a bonanza to all arms suppliers. And today it is now no longer just a question of funneling arms to Ukraine, but in fact, practically all the arms producers, the military industrial complexes of around in Europe, North America, etc., they're basically lining up to ensure that the forthcoming budgets that will be published soon will have huge amounts of money set aside, not just to arm Ukraine, but to increase the military preparedness of these countries going forward, whether there is a war in Ukraine or not, independently of the war in Ukraine, etc. But these arms manufacturers, while they want all these contracts, they are being given contracts, very lucrative ones, that are massively cost plus, making enormous super profits for them. These very arms manufacturers that have been coddled by the state are falling behind both the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China in the very military technology that they claim is their forte. Just to give you one example, they have not been able yet to develop the sort of supersonic missiles that Russia and even China today boast of. So in that sense, if they're really about the defense of these Western countries, they're not actually playing their role. for all the praises all the praise being heaped on private enterprise and so on. Further, NATO and EU membership in general have historically essentially hardwired neoliberalism into the country that gains membership into either or both of these organizations. And of course, I've already said how even before Ukraine is joining NATO, its neoliberalization is extremely advanced. Further, since the Madrid summit last year, NATO has also been extending its scope to China, which means that it is taking its members into the even more dangerous territory of confronting China militarily, presumably over Taiwan. NATO is sacrificing Europe's industrial base. Many would argue that this war may be against Russia, but the biggest victim of this war is actually Europe's industrial base, particularly Germany's industrial base. This base had already been depleted by neoliberal policies, also encouraged by the United States and peddled by the United States. And now, of course, it is being further deteriorated. And the balance of power, balance of productive power, is the US is attempting to change it against European capital. NATO is making Europe less, not more secure. Contrary to the hype, as a consequence, I would say that NATO is not united. We keep hearing that how much the war in Ukraine has served to unite European countries. But if you think about the very, very differential way in which the effects of the war, the costs of the war have been borne, this selective way in which different countries have participated in it, I would say that there is more appearance than reality to the unity of NATO, something we can discuss more fully. Two more points. NATO is not really clear about what it can realistically achieve. While it keeps proclaiming illusory maximalist aims of the victory of Ukraine over Russia, what you see behind that is, in fact, an inability to decide exactly what is their realistic goal in Ukraine, which means that, it's actually a very irresponsible position to take, because here you're fueling a war, but you actually don't know what you are realistically aiming for. And finally, NATO's actions are separating Europe from the rest of the world. As you know, if you look at a map of all the countries that are imposing sanctions on Russia and that are sending arms to Ukraine, that map essentially is not much larger than the imperial world of 1914, and that is very telling. This world is being clearly separated from the rest of the world that has no investment in imperialism. So these are the dimensions of the current situation. Now, having sort of outlined these, maybe we're in a position to look at, dig a little bit more into the history of Ukraine. So if we try to understand why NATO was formed, we must first of all place it in the history of capitalism and imperialism, and especially to understand the very special role that the United States came to play in it from the 20th century onwards. NATO was never a defensive organization. It has always been aggressive and expansionist from the start. And this has to do, as will become clear, to the United States' desire to essentially preside over a subordinated world, a world subordinated and opened up to penetration by U.S. corporations, their goods, their needs for investment, their needs for raw materials, their need for labor, etc., etc. And in this drive, which the U.S. has been pursuing since the early 20th century, the U.S. at least has no stop button, which is why NATO at the moment seems to have no stop button. The creation of NATO was an effort to ensure that Europe remained imperialist and, of course, capitalist after the Second World War, and followed the US lead in doing so. It did so in a way that served US interests. This also meant that Europe was capitalist, despite the fact that there was a huge groundswell of working class empowerment in the post-Second World War period, which made it a bit iffy whether this outcome could be assured. And as you know, American covert and overt activities in Europe were working overtime and non-stop to try to avert this possibility. Now, the thing about imperialism that we as Marxists, as communists, etc., we have forgotten is that, or not all of us, but many of us, many leftists anyway, have forgotten, is that it is necessary to capitalism. There are too many Marxists out there who say things like, imperialism is bad. Of course, we condemn it. It's terrible when it happens, but it's not necessary to capitalism. And in a large part of my work, I've argued that the reason for this is the fact that very early on, there are many things. Imperialism itself is one of the reasons, but nevertheless, theoretically, one of the reasons is that many Marxists essentially, instead of fighting the influence of neoclassical economics, they have been trying to adapt Marx's analysis into neoclassical economics. It's a vain enterprise. It has only generated false questions and false answers, but nevertheless, this kind of position is fairly widespread in many parts of the left. So today's so imperialism is necessary to capitalism because capitalism is contradictory, and the management of the contradictions of capitalism becomes easier if you can inflict the costs of that management onto subordinated territories. Capitalism always needs more markets than it has at home. It needs more investment outlets than it has at home. It therefore needs to have export its commodities. It also needs its financial institutions and rentier interests need to suck rent and interest out of the rest of the world as well. And of course, in order to ensure its legitimacy, it needs to undertake certain reforms, and that is also made easier if a given capitalist nation is also the beneficiary of imperialist profits and rent and interest and so on, super profits. So ultimately, essentially, if you think about capitalism as being creating uneven development, then imperialism is essentially a way to maintain this unevenness of capitalist development. And of course, other countries, subordinated countries, would try to fight this. And one of the key ways of fighting it, if they are able and willing to do so, is, of course, to engage in combined development, which, in my interpretation, is nothing more or less than the state-directed, if necessary, protectionist industrialization of these countries, which the Soviet Union undertook in its time, China undertook, and to some extent, even some capitalist developing countries have managed to undertake to a certain extent. Now, so this is the a dialectic of uneven and combined development, which is really nothing more than imperialism and anti-imperialism, which is about the political and geopolitical economy of the world. Now, today's rich countries are themselves either all imperialist countries, or they are part of the imperial system in that they benefited from the imperialism of the major imperialist countries and did not need colonies of their own as a result. And such imperialism, ever since its beginnings, has always been resisted. But up to 1914, it continued to expand and gain power. And in 1914 was when the very inter-imperialist rivalry that so accelerated the expansion of and deepening of imperialism in the decades leading up to 1914 eventually erupted into the First World War and what Arno Meyer called the 30 Years Crisis. And in my own writing, I view this period of 1914 to 1945, encompassing two world wars, a Great Depression, etc., as an extremely grave crisis of both imperialism and capitalism. Meyer, in fact, even called it an international civil war, which, as I say, involved the two revolutions, decolonization and massive working class mobilization in the developed capitalist world, including Europe. Now, this is the context in which US ambitions to play an important role in the imperial system come in. The way, from what I have been able to find out, essentially US policy-making ruling elites in the early 20th century, before the outbreak of the First World War, could clearly see that Britain's ability to dominate the world economy was manifestly weakening. Of course, Britain had already lost productive preponderance in the late 19th century, circa 1870, but thereafter it had managed to retain a disproportionate influence thanks to the gold sterling system. And the United States essentially said in the early 20th century, as Britain's ability to manage the gold sterling system was weakening, that it was going to take over Britain's role as what they saw it as the managing segment of the world economy. Um, obviously they were very aware that they could never acquire an empire the size that of the British Empire, but they said, "Oh, we don't need an empire, we are going to make the dollar the world's money," and but completely forgetting that in fact the Britain's ability to offer the world sterling as world's money was completely dependent on empire, and without that, empire was, making the dollar the world's money was going to be very difficult. I'm not going to tell this part of the story, although we can discuss it later. But for now, let me just say that the United States ambition was to in fact create a world economy, a unified world economy, unified under its domination and open to its corporations and capitalists. In pursuit of this ambition, the United States very clearly calculated its entry into the two wars. Both these calculations were based on how much of an economic boost the wars gave the US economy. And if you look at a chart of US growth from the middle of the 19th century till today, you see two very, very prominent peaks, the like of which have never been repeated. And those two peaks of growth were the two world wars. The United States benefited tremendously from Europe's wars and of course, war-related suffering. And it was US actions, and this is something my colleague Michael Hudson has shown very well in his 1972 book, Super Imperialism. He says that basically the United States, having given the Allies to believe that they were getting all the war material that the United States was sending them during the First World War, on a probably, practically grand basis, at the end of the war turned around and said that it wanted repayment for all these things. And when Britain reminded the United States that, you shouldn't require repayment, we have not in the past required repayment from allies with whom we have aided in a war effort, the United States turned around and said that it had not joined the war as an ally, but as an associate. And it demanded reparations. Of course, Keynes's the economic consequences of the peace, his condemnation of the Versailles Treaty, contains a not only very thinly veiled plea to the United States to not demand repayment. Nevertheless, the US did, and there was, and as Hudson points out, that there's not a single act that more securely ensured that World War II would take place than this act of demanding repayment, because that then led France and England to demand reparations from Germany, and the whole the whole sort of economic, financial, etc. turmoil that this created thereafter. So essentially, the United States has a long history of provoking and profiting from war far away from home. And Europe has already paid a big price for this, and it ought not to pay, it ought to stop doing that. We are also told that NATO was created in order to fight the Cold War, but actually the NATO was not created till 1949, and the United States was already fighting the Cold War, had already inaugurated the Cold War by bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because the purpose of this, as I've shown in a long piece I wrote recently called Capitalism and Nuclear Weapons, the United States did this entirely in not to defeat Japan, as this has been discredited now by American historians themselves, not to defeat Japan, but to demonstrate to the Soviet Union the mighty arms that it now possessed. However, the ambition that, so one final point I'll make about US ambitions is that the ambitions that US was pursuing were already futile. One of my arguments in geopolitical economy has been that British dominance over the world system was for a time inevitable because Britain was the first industrializer. And eventually its sterling system was made possible, of course, by its vast empire. But the very industrialization of the United States, which took place alongside the industrialization of several other powers, had already made the world multipolar back in the 1870s, back in the late 19th century. And in this new context, the United States' ability to dominate the world, the United States' effort to emulate British dominance was impossible, even in the light form of merely making the dollar the world's money. Nevertheless, NATO was created allegedly to defend against the Soviet threat, but in reality, the Soviet position throughout this period had always been very defensive. The Soviet Union, of course, initially did not have nuclear weapons, and then by the time it and in 1949, of course, the Soviet Union, in April 1949, when the NATO was created, the Soviet Union did not have nuclear weapons. It was exhausted from the war to which it had made such a big contribution to the victory, and had already agreed to the spheres of influence idea. So there was absolutely no threat. And again, most historians today would agree, but nevertheless, the United States hyped up the threat. And so NATO was actually created to preserve imperialism at a time when it was rapidly declining with the onset of decolonization. And there was not only was decolonization occurring, but there was also increasing inter-imperialist solidarity among third world countries and between the communist countries and third world countries. And all of this was playing out at the United Nations, which was definitely not friendly towards imperialism. So against this trend towards decolonization, rather than seeking collective security through the United Nations, NATO was created as the instrument through which the US expanded the concept of European security in global directions, inserting NATO as the instrument for Europe to secure access to critical raw materials, not through better relations with the independent states that were coming out of that were succeeding the colonial subjugated territories, but rather by resisting decolonization militarily and engaging in neo-colonial activities. This was the only reason why Europe needed North American support, diplomatic and military, whether for the British in the Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia, the French in Indochina and Algeria, or the Dutch in Indonesia, or the Belgians in Congo or Rwanda. Such support from the US, or should we say intervention, of course, also prevented the unfolding of tendencies that saw European security itself on the continent as involving better relations with the Soviet Union. Now, if this was so basically what we are saying is that if NATO had not been created, there was absolutely no reason to imagine that Western Europe and the Soviet Union could not have coexisted peacefully. They could have done, but this was prevented by NATO. If this was already bad enough, after the USSR tested its own atomic bomb and the Chinese communists won the civil war in that country a month later, and the US-led intervention in the Korean Civil War that resulted in the flattening of North Korea with arguably the worst bombing campaign ever in history, by the mid-1950s, the US had secured the agreement of the major European countries to its conception of NATO, and Germany entered it in 1955. And it was not until then that the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet-led communist bloc, created the Warsaw Pact in 1955 after Germany joined NATO. And so in this context, then we have to see the Cold War as nothing more than the continuation of Western imperialism, which is why new Cold Wars keep emerging. We should not be surprised, because the Cold War was not something new. It was basically part of the drive towards imperialism, in which not only did China and the Soviet Union not have any right to pursue their own development in their own means, but nor did the Third World, and they were all to be subjugated in some sense or another. So in this sense, NATO has been the chief instrument in implicating Europe into the United States' vain and impossible quest for dominance, and therefore also irresponsible, because it is completely unrealistic. The fact of the matter was the United States did not achieve this dominance. The world was already bipolar. Europe was only insecurely embedded in NATO, with France leaving its military structures between 1966 and 2009, and many communist and developing countries aiding one another. And this sort of world and these sorts of developments reached a peak in the 1970s when the United States suffered the ignominious defeat in Vietnam. It had to break the dollar's link with gold. Its economy was suffering stagflation. Its European allies were demanding that it be more responsible in its economic management. Meanwhile, European countries, particularly Germany, was pursuing its own Ostpolitik with the Soviet Union and the Eastern Europe, forcing the United States into détente. And people in the United States as well, scholars in the United States, were writing books like America as an Ordinary Nation. This is one of the titles, basically saying that the United States' quest for dominance had failed. Third world countries were demanding a new international economic order, which was the opposite, essentially, of what the US wanted to see. And even President Carter was reduced to essentially acknowledging that the United States must change its foreign policy towards the rest of the world. But at this point in time, basically, there were two very clear directions in which the West could go and the United States could go. One was the United States could accept that it had failed in its quest, and generally first world countries could accept that they needed to they needed to they needed to go left, that is to say, to increase the level of state intervention in the economy to deal with crises and so on. But instead, as we all know, the neoliberals won the day. And since then, what we've seen is the progressive freeing of capital from taxation, from regulation, from various social obligations, and so on, and of course, a war on labor. Now, in this context, in the 1980s, you saw not only you saw the adoption of neoliberalism, but you also saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, and eventually the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And this created a temporary illusion of Western strength. People like Francis Fukuyama started talking about the end of history, and people expected at that time that the world would become unipolar, sort of, united by the United States under its leadership, and the world would also enjoy a peace dividend. But neither of these things were possible, and this was for interconnected reasons. And the reason lies with the adoption of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism was, the promise of neoliberalism was that it was going to revive the productive economies of first world countries, which were stagnating and suffering from stagflation. But in reality, of course, it could not do so, for the simple reason that all the the idea was that competition would sort of revive the animal spirits of the capitalist class and so on. But the fact of the matter is that the capitalism the capital to which they were giving all the freedoms had already become monopoly capital in the early 20th century. It was not about to change into competitive capitalism suddenly. So instead of reviving the productive dynamism of capitalist countries, what we've seen instead is that capital has used these freedoms not to expand productive capacity, not to become, more competitive, more efficient, etc., more dynamic. No, it has used this freedom essentially to increase the amount of financial activity, something that we call financialization, which is directly correlated with the economic weakness of the West. And this meant that on the one hand, the neoliberal West was essentially declining, suffering from several now decades of low growth, low investment, increasing inequality, etc. Meanwhile, all the countries that were not pursuing neoliberalism or pursuing it selectively were actually industrializing to a better extent, with China, of course, in the forefront. So you began to see within a couple of decades of the end of the Cold War, a shift in the center of gravity of the world economy towards China, with capitalism once again confronted with socialism as a superior, essentially, form of economic organization. So the result has been and the and the reason therefore the world did not enjoy a peace dividend had to do with the fact that the United States in particular and the West in general reacted to this decline of influence not with equanimity, not by trying to improve their economies, but instead by asserting particularly US unilateral military aggression abroad. And the result has been a string of military failures and quagmires, the rise of China, and to some extent some other less than completely neoliberal capitalist countries, and therefore the advance of multipolarity. Meanwhile, the West continued to suffer from an economic malaise of inequality, low growth, low productive investment, massive financialization, social division, political breakdown, including events like Trump, Brexit, the rise of the right-wing parties in so many countries, and also, I would say, an incredible amount of cultural degeneration, of which I would say the current situation with the media in particular, and the way in which the media is sort of essentially works with the governments of these countries more surely than any media of any communist country work with their governments. It's just incredible. The and you know, the fact that people do not believe this is also manifest in accusations and counter accusations about fake news and the proliferation of alternative media websites. So there is continuing malaise in the West in these ways. And in this process, by the way, European attempts, Europe has made attempts to strike out in a different direction. I'm not completely endorsing these attempts. These are still attempts of European capitalist countries, but they would still be better than completely cooperating in what the United States wants. In the 1990s, for example, this was squashed by the war in Yugoslavia. And in the 2000s, right up until very, very recently, when people like Macron were calling NATO brain dead, etc., you had seen a very serious attempt to try to create a try to create an independent security policy for Western countries, which, by the way, included better relations with Russia, which were being pursued by European countries right up to the eve of the current war in Ukraine. So we come back to the present. The current war over Ukraine is a US quest to subordinate, perhaps dismember Russia. We should not forget that this has been the aim of the Anglo-American liberal and neoliberal powers for a very, very long time. And the aim is also to do it at a low cost and even at a profit, while destroying what was Ukraine and what it might have been with the Minsk Accords, which, let's not forget, in its second version was negotiated by Germany and France. The US also aims to destroy European industrial capacity and shift its leading economy away from the last vestiges of productivism that it has left. And the idea is to resubordinate Europe to this now even more vain ambition to dominate the world economy. In this context, and these are my final few words, the left position has become too confused by references to invasion of Ukraine and Russian imperialism, because it fundamentally misunderstands imperialism. It takes the invasion of Ukraine as though, as the only act of imperialism, completely forgetting the civil war that had been going on in Ukraine over the past 8 years and the extremely bad faith actions of the West throughout since the end of the Soviet Union. And it completely fails to understand that today the territory actually has been more about defending territories and defending a country and defending Russian-speaking minorities. And what the left is calling Russian imperialism is a defense of its own security and that of the Donbass against the West's true imperialism, which does not care about territory and is also very happy to sacrifice populations in order to secure access for its corporation in open economies, which is essentially subordinated economies. And the left is also too confused by actually existing socialism because it does not understand imperialism. Because imperialism has been, in fact, about the control of the world, whether with with or without colonial control. And socialism has been a resistance to it. What socialist countries had to do was, in fact, not only to industrialize without the luxury of imperialism, as the West did, but also to industrialize against the unremitting opposition of imperialism. And when you have to do that, this is what socialism looks like, I'd like to suggest. So a properly socialist and anti-imperialist position in today's context, in the context of the proxy war against Russia, would demand an end to sanctions, an end to military supplies to Ukraine, immediate negotiations without withdrawal, because withdrawal would leave, at least certain types of withdrawal would leave leave the Donbas communities open to further victimization by certain forces in Ukraine, and an end to NATO and a support for a pluripolar world whose keystone principle is the ability of every country to run its economy in its own way in the interests of its own people. So I'll end with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the talk, Radhika. It was very interesting. So if that's okay with you, Mark is going to read some of the questions that are on the chat. So please.
Exactly. Mark. Yeah, exactly. So thank you very much, Radhika, for your talk. It was very rich in detail, and it was a summary of the nature of NATO and the present state of things. Now, going through the chat, JRJ says, very interesting talk. Thanks, Radhika. I have a question. How can Spain or any other NATO country leave this organization? And are there any examples of countries that have left?
I would say that Spain can leave this organization. I don't think there are any examples of countries that have left, other than France leaving the military structures of NATO for a while. But I don't see why Spain or any other NATO country cannot leave. And the more countries that leave, the more they can also then jointly secure what little is needed for their defense, because it's not as though Russia is about to overrun Europe or anything like that. All these so-called security threats are completely hyped up. Think about it this way. One of the really interesting things about NATO is that NATO did not undertake a single military operation as long as the Soviet Union existed, because the Soviet Union's position was a deterrent to NATO. As soon as the Soviet Union ceased to exist, NATO has been basically continuously at war in some part of the world or another. This is not in the interest of European security. It actually is making Europe less secure. It's making Europe more insecure. There's absolutely no reason why NATO should exist. I mean, what might one be afraid of in leaving NATO, other than the aggression of the NATO powers themselves?
Exactly. So, for instance, would you think that exiting the NATO would suppose the substitution of the NATO for another entity, or would need the creation of a new security entity?
Personally, as I say, the question is that there needs to be a realistic assessment of what security threats there are. I just don't think NATO has permitted such a realistic assessment. And the fact that European countries were willing to work towards and countenance creating their own security apparatus, which included better relations with Russia, shows you that. And that's what Mrs. Merkel, by the way, was pursuing. I have read her, this interview in which she's alleged to have said that we were buying time for Ukraine. She said nothing of the sort. She said that, yes, in retrospect, it bought time for Ukraine. Ukraine used this time, but she did not say that's why we did it, because otherwise the Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2 absolutely make no sense. Why would they have devoted so much time and effort to coming up with the Minsk agreements, etc.? I think I think Europeans should really look into the extent to which not only have the interests of, the interests of ordinary Europeans have always been opposed to that of NATO, but even without taking ordinary Europeans into account, there have been many tensions among European countries and the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And these tensions also are based in the very, very different model of capitalism that is the Anglo-American neoliberal form, and the more productive forms that you see, particularly in countries like Germany and Japan, and to a lesser extent in some other European countries as well.
Okay. Thank you very much, Radhika. So going through the next question, Curious George tells us, well, hi, Radhika, thanks for your amazing talk. Do you think that US via NATO is going to start antagonizing China more and more up to the point of a war? Is this a scenario we can expect in the near future?
Now, this is also just absolutely a fascinating question, and I must say I'm going to give a sort of a on the one hand and on the other hand sort of answer. So on the one hand, there is absolutely no doubt that US officials are already ratcheting up the tensions. They are not only there's this crazy balloon incident that has taken place. And at least one meme on social media that I saw was basically implying that the balloon incident is a distraction from the revelations of Seymour Hersh about who, in fact, blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. And this, otherwise, that would have been very explosive. Whereas, the media now has, can talk about UFOs and all these crazy things instead, which is so on the one hand, and so there is that. And in this context, what we are also seeing is that the United States is engaged in, is engaged in secret talks with Taiwan. So there is no doubt that there are important sectors of the US administration that see the possibility of provoking China via Taiwan, just as Russia was provoked via Ukraine. So this is the scenario playing out in the minds of many policymakers. Having said that, we will also see the same messy situation that we see right now. The United States is both fighting a war against Russia and not fighting a war against Russia. It wants to have its cake and eat it too. And we will see a similar scenario at the other side, because in many ways, China is a far more formidable ally. Far more formidable enemy. So in that sense, I think that you see, one of the other things one has to remember is that, we always read these impressive figures about how much money the US spends on its military. The United States spends more than the next 10 states combined, the next 20 states combined. Take your pick, depending on the year, this ratio changes, but it's always something like that. Now, what is the bang that the United States gets for all these billions and trillions of bucks? It's actually very little, because if you think about it, the United States has not won a single war, except if it is a question of overrunning tiny countries like Grenada or Panama. Where has it won a war? It has not been able to secure its military. All it has done is destroy. It had to accept the division of the Korean Peninsula. It lost in Vietnam. It lost in Afghanistan. There is no US order in Iraq or Libya or Syria or anywhere. The United States does not have the capacity to fight. Nevertheless, it wants the results that will come from fighting. So then it engages in all these hybrid forms of warfare, including, by the way, the encouragement of color revolutions, the financing of color revolutions, etc. So this is what we are looking at. So this kind of United States wants what it cannot have. And part of the reason for emphasizing this is to understand that if the United States could actually acquire what it wanted, it would be one thing, but it can't. But in the process, it is destroying a lot of things. It's destroying Europe's economy. It's destroying Ukraine. It may destroy Taiwan. This is just completely irresponsible. The United States should not deserve the slightest respect of anybody. In this present form, obviously, yes.
Okay, so you say basically that a war with China would be difficult to afford.
The United States will do what it can to try. The United States has been trying to thwart the rise of China through every means at its disposal, including chips wars and what have you. Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Tibet, you name it, it will use every instrument in its bag, right? But the fact is, it will not achieve it.
Yeah.
Instead, however, it is involving the European countries and all the other allies into this fruitless pursuit, when in fact, what all these countries should be doing, and they know they should be doing it, is simply making good relations with all other countries and saying, and entering into relations of mutual benefit, accepting that all countries have the right to develop and industrialize, which is not granted at the moment by the United States. And that's, when I started out my talk, I said that at the Munich Security Conference, these two opposing conceptions of the world order are pitted against one another. One is what the US and certain of its allies like to call the rules-based international order, in which the rules are, we make the rules and you obey the rules, and we keep changing the rules as we like, right? And the other is a conception of the world order, which is based on the sovereign equality of nations. It's based on the idea that this includes the right to pursue whatever type of economic system you want, so long as your relations with your neighbors are based on a principle of mutual benefit, that they are based on cooperation, etc. And this is what imperialism cannot allow and will not allow.
Thank you very much, Radhika. So going for the third question, Pablo says, well, thank you, Dr. Desai, for your incredible presentation. A question: more and more global South countries are challenging the NATO narrative. The narrative that NATO had nothing to do with the war in Ukraine, such as Mexico and South Africa. Even Macron has claimed in Munich that the West imposes double standards. The question is, what do you think could be the implications of this? And could a front of global South countries push for peace in Ukraine?
This is a really fascinating question, and if you think about it, like I said, if you look at a map of the countries that are cooperating with the US-led drive of war against Russia, they are actually very few, and the overwhelming majority of the presently or formerly communist countries and the overwhelming majority of countries of the third world are in fact not buying the NATO narrative. That's absolutely right. And like I said, even Europe is not completely united. Like you say, Macron, I actually haven't read this story, but it's interesting. I will look for it. But Macron has been quite critical of NATO in the past. Macron has continued to talk with President Putin throughout this period. So what is basically happening is that neoliberalism has shown that West capitalism as we know it, and capitalism of any sort, is really past its use-by date. It's finished. All it can offer us is increasing inequality, unproductive economies, corporate price gouging, etc., etc. And you are seeing the results most fully in the most neoliberal and most financialized countries, such as the United Kingdom and the United States. This is basically my part of my argument in Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War. So you are seeing that. And meanwhile, the rest of the world takes a much more pragmatic view of how to, or much of the rest of the world. Let's do what works. If we need state ownership, we'll have state ownership. If we need to have welfare programs, we'll have welfare programs. Whatever it takes to develop our societies and economies. And that is what the competing, the idea of or multi or pluripolarity, or multipolar or pluripolar world order, that's the competing vision. And I would say that by siding with the United States, Europe is choosing not to side with the economically most dynamic and politically more stable and internationally more cooperative type of relations, which will benefit Europe if that's what Europe chooses. It is making the fundamentally wrong choice, and the stakes in this choice are now very high. Europe can choose between being a vassal of the United States and being part of a thriving economy on the Euro-Asian subcontinent, which will, and of course, including practically every other economy in North and South America as well, that will not cooperate with the United States. I think these are two competing visions of the world. All the world stands at a crossroads, and at the moment, I would say that Europe is really basically the part of the world that could change its position, but for reasons I don't understand, is taking a practically suicidal position.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, and relating to this last thing that you've mentioned, Radhika, Sergio asks us, what do you think of the position of the EU leaders and the EU institutions about the Ukraine war? And do you think that they will change their approach towards a negotiated solution in the short or mid term?
I think the possibility still exists, partly because I know I think that, look, you can't be a European and not shake your head at the actions of your governments. Okay, and you probably would. It's quite possible that even the not quite possible. I know this is true, that the capitalist class itself does not want this. Remember, for all the talk of unity and sanctions, every country in Europe has impose sanctions very selectively, designed to do only what it can afford to do, etc. Many companies continue to operate in Russia. And also, the China is not about to leave Russia's side. So, and the United States wants to provoke China as well. Meanwhile, Olaf Scholz has been to China. Many other European countries are keeping channels to China open. So, I would say that, and of course, on the street, resistance to the war is rising, for the simple reason that no matter what you may think, of course, the European media has been pretty bad about the essentially, propagandizing in favor of Ukraine. Although I find this is such a problematic thing, because when you are in favor of Ukraine, you are essentially saying, let's destroy it, because that's what's happening right now. But this is what favor of Ukraine looks like. But nevertheless, people on the street are opposed to the war. And as we were saying, today or tomorrow, there is going to be an enormous demonstration in Washington where the United States is opposed to the war. Anyway, so both at the level of the capitalist class and at the level of the people, there is dissatisfaction with the current direction. You can, every so often you can see, this Seymour Hersh story is, no matter how much you try to bury it, it's going to have an effect. If this is the relation, I think that at some point the time will come, and it'll probably be at a time when it becomes very clear that Russia has made the gains that it wants. And it's not to take over, I don't think, the whole of Ukraine or anything. It is, I think, what they were saying at the start, which is to secure Donbass, to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine as a threat to Russia. I think once Russia achieves some semblance of this, there will be a lot of people who will come out and say, okay, it's time to negotiate. And I think that this may include leaders of some very prominent European nations.
Okay, thank you very much, Radhika. I believe these are all the questions we had in the chat, but I believe Ferran himself had a question to ask you. So
yeah, so my question for you, Radhika, is so I think you're aware of these debates in academia and social media that basically they say that the new geopolitical moment is characterized by this sort of like inter-imperialist conflict between the US on the one hand, Russia and China, and they say basically that all great powers behave in a similar way, right? So you kind of mentioned this in your talk, but I just want to know, like, what you think about this debate, and also theoretically speaking. I know that your theory you talk about uneven combined development, but I also wanted to know how can we sort of like understand this, what we are witnessing now.
Sure. So first of all, I would say that, this is the international relations discipline itself has a lot to answer for, because that is that's what they say, all countries behave exactly the same. But if you actually, and these social science disciplines are precisely ahistorical, like they produce these theories which have completely nothing to do with the actual history of what happened. If you look at the history of international relations, you will see that the way to understand the international relations of the capitalist world is in terms of imperialism and anti-imperialism. And in this context, the purpose of saying that all countries behave in exactly the same way is actually to excuse the aggressive actions of the imperialist powers. Because if all countries would behave the same way if they could, then there is no reason to criticize what the United States is doing. right? This is the function of this discourse. In reality, different states behave very differently because they aim for different things. China is manifestly pursuing cooperation with other powers. And, as for Russia and China being imperialist, just as imperialist as the United States, I mean, there is one very simple visual refutation of this. Please Google a map of US bases around the world, are outside the US, that is to say, internet bases are out, US bases outside the United States, Russian bases outside Russia, and Chinese bases outside China. The contrast could not be more telling. The US has bases has ringed the whole world around with bases. It has thousands of them. Meanwhile, China and Russia may have a handful of bases here or there, but the main purpose of their security policy is their defense of their country. They're actually doing what it says on the tin, what you say security policy is doing. Meanwhile, the United States has such an inflated conception of its security that it thinks that things happen thousands of miles away from the United States are germane to its security interests. This is completely ludicrous. It can only be possible if the United States, it can only be true if we grant the United States the right to be imperialist. Otherwise, it makes absolutely no sense, right? So I would say that, in fact, if the United States and generally all Western countries, because I'm not saying that European countries don't have their own independent imperialist interests, they do, and they try to secure them. But without the United States, they would have been a lot less successful, because remember, imperialism is curbed by two things. One is the need to have a domestic economy that actually serves the interests of the people and is productive and so on. And the other is the resistance, the anti-imperialist resistance. And this was already mounting to such an extent that the Europeans would not have been able to even extend their period of colonialism as much as they did in the post-Second World War period without the help of the United States. So they would have then had to come to terms with the fact that there are other countries in the world which you must deal with. And they were also sort of, as I say, Ostpolitik, the attempts in the 1990s and again in the new century by Europe to try to come up with an independent security policy. All of this shows that there are very large numbers of people in Europe, including members of policy-making elites, who realize that there is another way. And I think the point is to point to that other way rather than sort of just taking it for granted that these governments, what I'm saying is that I think it's Bloch, although I'm not sure, but I think it's Ernst Bloch who said, in the contradiction lies the hope. And there are many contradictions between Europe and the United States. And I think we should also point to them without necessarily relying on them to do the work that communists should do in terms of building a popular movement against NATO and against militarism and imperialism.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So if that's okay with you, we can end here. So I just want to give you thank you so much for your talk. It was very interesting. We are very grateful for your time. And we hope we can talk to you again in the future.
I hope so. It was very good.
Also, for the audience, I want to tell the audience that you have a channel or this group of the Geopolitical group that they should check because it's very interesting. And yeah, thank you so much. And I hope you have a nice evening.
In fact, if I may just say, the channel that people may want to look out for is, there are two channels. One is the International Manifesto Group, of which I'm the convener, and we have wonderful webinars which are making similar arguments like the one I've just made. And if you're interested, please check us out on YouTube. And the other channel is that Ben Norton, he very much liked the idea of geopolitical economy when he encountered my book. And so he has converted his website from Multipolarista into Geopolitical Economy Report. And on that, Michael Hudson and I have a fortnightly show, which is just called the Geopolitical Economy Hour. And you may want to check that out. And one final thing, if you're interested, Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, my book is available free in PDF form. So you just have to Google it, go to the website and download it. So perhaps some of you may want to check it out as well. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Radhika. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Radhika.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.